And welcome to this very, very beautiful first edition of a wonderful new program in a new quarter on Amogate Radio Communications. My name is Tolu Omodara, and what a joy, what a pleasure, what a delight, what a honor, what a privilege to be bringing you this maiden edition of our new ACT program titled Driving Economic Growth with Innovation. Driving Economic Growth with Innovation. How have you been? We've missed being with you. I have missed doing this with you every Tuesday, but it was important for us to take a rest after the last quarter to refuel, to refresh, to refuel, and to be back better and stronger, all for your growth, your development, your enlightenment, your illumination, and of course, our national advancement, right, across the different nations of the world. So last quarter, if you remember, we took a very deep dive into developing national innovation systems for absorptive capacity. I repeat, developing national innovation systems for absorptive capacity was the thrust of our program, was the theme of the program for quarter 1, 2025. And we spent considerable time examining the different segments, the different sub-themes of that overall topic. We asked ourselves, what does it mean to develop a national innovation system? What is a national innovation system? Even within that, we looked at what innovation is, then what makes it a system, right? What is a national innovation system versus an institutional innovation system, for instance, or an organizational innovation system. And of course, we then spent considerable time delving into the issue of absorptive capacity. What exactly is absorptive capacity? And we established the fact that absorptive capacity has to do with translating creative output into optimal social and economic development outcomes. I repeat, absorptive capacity we saw last quarter has to do with translating creative output into optimal social and economic development outcomes. And to be honest with you, we are continuing from that flow because there is still a lot that nations need to do, right? There's still a lot that nations need to examine. There's still a lot that nations need to establish. There's still a lot that nations need to monitor. There's still a lot that nations need to fine-tune, refine, expand to ensure that there are optimum, take note of that word, optimum social and economic outcomes flowing from creative activities. And that is the reason why we decided to continue this quarter on that thrust, right? On that theme, on that flow. How exactly do we drive economic growth through innovation? That's the in other words, we are now looking more at the part B of last quarter's program, right? The part A of last quarter's program was about developing national innovation systems, right? And we looked at the different components of the systems, the academia, the industry, the interaction, the coordination, all of those things that ensure that we have an effective national innovation system, right? And then we also looked at the second part, which is the absorptive capacity, which helps to ensure that optimum outcomes are extracted from the innovation systems nations develop. However, in this quarter, we must be honest with you, at least 75%, if not more, of the focus would be on the economic outcomes, in other words, the absorptive capacity, but not just the capacity now, but also what the absorptive capacity translates into, because there is a difference between capacity and actual outputs, outcomes, and impacts. In other words, I may have the capacity to achieve certain things, but that does not necessarily mean that they are achieved. An organization may have the potential to attain certain revenue and profit targets, but that does not necessarily translate into the attainment of those targets. So absorptive capacity, of course, talks about how you can translate all of those economic or rather all of those innovative possibilities into economic output. However, in this particular quarter, we are looking more not just at the capacity, but the growth, the expected growth that nations should attain as a result of innovative activities. Take note, we didn't say creative activities. We made a distinction last quarter, and we are still going to continue to emphasize it. There is a difference between creativity and innovation, and to be honest, that is what we would first establish again, even as we continue this quarter. So when we say driving economic growth with innovation, we want to ask, why don't we say driving innovation or driving economic growth with creativity. Because like we said last quarter, and we still feel the need to emphasize this quarter as we begin this quarter, there is a significant difference between creativity and innovation. Innovation is implementation. I repeat, innovation is implementation. Creativity can stop at conceptualization. But when you talk about innovation, we are talking about conceptualization all the way to commercialization. We said that last quarter, and we feel the need to re-emphasize this quarter. So conceptualizing either completely new things or building on existing things. We talked about incremental innovation, and we're still going to refer to it. There is incremental innovation, which happens a lot, right? We talked about nations like Denmark, which tend to take existing models and build on it. That's what you call bottom-up innovation. But there is also the more architectural form of innovation, right? That's not incremental innovation, it's more of architectural innovation. What architectural innovation does is that it rebuilds, it restructures, it re-envisions existing models. So that's more radical than incremental innovation. And that again, of course, has a strength. So there is incremental innovation, there is architectural innovation, but ultimately, whatever the model of innovation that you are deploying as a nation, right, whether it's incremental, whether it's architectural, or the revolutionary form, which goes beyond the architectural innovation, and that is what you call the discontinuous innovation, right? The discontinuous innovation has to do with the creation of absolutely new approaches to meet or anticipate a market need. Take note. Absolutely new approaches to meet or anticipate a market need. So there is a discontinuous innovation. Now, these have been identified by researchers. The incremental, the architectural, and the discontinuous innovations are different types of innovations that have been identified as researchers. Now, whichever you choose to do as a nation, whichever your national innovation system chooses to emphasize or optimize or maximize, what is important is that all of this must translate into economic growth. Extremely important. Otherwise, you don't have the optimization of those creative activities. And that is why innovation is not just about creativity, it's about the whole spectrum, all the way from conceptualization to implementation. And that is why innovation, like we said last quarter, for it to be truly innovation, has to envision and factor in commercialization. I'm going to say that again. For innovation to be truly innovation and not just creativity, it has to envision and make provision for commercialization. That's where we talk about scaling. We emphasized that last quarter, and we are going to dwell even more into it this quarter. Scaling, whole spectrum scaling, whole scale commercialization, right? So one of the things we said last quarter, and which we are also going to repeat, is that when you talk about absorptive capacity, in other words, translating your creative activities into optimal social and economic development, you have to think about meeting market needs, right? It's not just about creating innovative solutions or creative solutions. It's also about ensuring that those solutions are anticipating and responding to market needs. I repeat, it's also about ensuring that those creative solutions are anticipating and responding to market needs. Let me try to break that down a little bit. So, as of today, one of the biggest needs is, and so to say, assuaging of trade concerns, right? Or a how will I put it? A calming down of fears across nations. Different nations are having different kinds of concerns because of Trump 2.0. Trump 2.0 has been very aggressive with tariffs, and it has led to a lot of uncertainty, not just in the nations of the world where the tariffs are being targeted at, but also in the United States that is also having its share of rebuttals, right? So nations are also reacting, right? They are not just taking the tariffs, they are also whipping back the tariffs. Now, all of this has translated into a significant degree of uncertainty in the nations, but also in the United States. So across the world right now, if I am responsible for developing a national innovation system, especially for driving economic growth with innovation, one of the things I would want to task my team with, task the policy developers, the innovation policy developers and implementers with, is using innovation to respond to market uncertainties. Remember, when we talk about innovation, you are not just talking about creation of new products. Innovation also has to do with creating new products, services, and so on and so forth, right? So it's not just about I think we spoke about that last quarter, but I'm also going to repeat it. Creativity is not just about developing new products. It also has to do with creating new products, new services, new processes. We talk about process innovation. It's all about re-envisioning. Remember those three forms of innovation that I referred to earlier. One, the incremental innovation, which is largely bottom-up innovation, but there's also the architectural innovation, which is trying to redesign existing systems, processes, reinvent them, right? But there's also the discontinuous innovation, which can be very, very revolutionary, is way beyond radical. The discontinuous innovation is the development of excuse me or the discontinuous innovation that has to do with the creation of completely new approaches to meet or anticipate a market need. And take note of the word market need. When you are using innovation for driving economic growth, you are not creating in limbo. I'm going to say that again. When you are using innovation to drive economic growth, which is now the deeper thrust, the broader thrust of this quarter's program, it is not just about creating in limbo. Now, I need to say this for a balance. When you talk about innovation, like we said last quarter, sometimes you begin with exploration, right? And this is an amalgate thing. Ambidexterity is our strength and is one of our philosophies with either strategizing or policy making, right? There is always the aspect of innovation or the part of innovation where you're basically exploring, right? It's very, very important. And we said that last quarter, we said even though innovation is coordination between town and gown, is coordination between academia and industry, there is still the need for the foundational aspect of innovation, which often begins with academia and which tends to be more exploratory. In other words, you may not essentially be creating with a market need in mind, and that exploratory innovation is still very critical. It cannot be neglected. However, the exploratory innovation, and this is an amalgate model now, the exploratory innovation must eventually lead to the exploitative innovation. I repeat, for you to develop maximum economic outcomes and to begin to drive economic growth with innovation as the thrust of this quarter's program is eventually the exploratory innovation must eventually give way to the exploitative innovation. What is the difference? The exploitative innovation is now more directed at meeting, anticipating, and responding to market needs. So if I am responsible for developing national innovation systems, national innovation policies, national innovation processes, implementing and also monitoring, and of course recreating national innovation policies, processes, and so on and so forth, frameworks, one of the things I will be tasking my team with is creating new trade patterns that can boycott the excessive dominance of certain nations. That's what I'll be doing, because it's about anticipating and responding to market needs. It's not just about products, it's also about services and processes. So that is the part that I want us to get, to get up our loins, like it will be said in the Bible, or, to buckle up and to fasten our belts, like it will be said on the airplanes. In other words, get ready for the ride. It's going to be a very interesting quarter-long ride, and we're going to be looking very practically, honestly, at the more exploitative aspect of innovation, right? Without discounting the explorative foundation for innovation. very, very important. The part that comes from academia, the part that comes from conceptualizing, the part that may not necessarily be directed at a certain need, it is still very, very important. There must be the room and also the funds, very important, right? The frameworks, the processes, the support to, not just encourage, but even to stimulate exploratory innovation, which may not necessarily be directed at market needs, but ultimately the patterns, right? The processes, the procedures from now extracting optimal value from the output of exploratory innovation to ensure full exploitative value must be created, must be fine-tuned, must be developed, and must be continually reviewed. My name is Tolu Omadara. This is Amoge Radio Communications, and this is a maiden edition of Driving Economic Growth with Innovation. This beautiful Tuesday, April 15, 2025. We're so glad, we're so grateful to have you with us, and we are discussing driving economic growth with innovation. Now, we've talked a little bit about the essence of the economic growth part of it. We've talked about the fact that innovation, we've more or less reminded ourselves, for those who have been following since last quarter. For those who have not been following, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's very important. There's a lot that you stand to learn there, either as policymakers or as policy implementers or as policy influencers or even policy demanders. There's a lot you stand to gain there. We've talked a lot, remind ourselves about some of the things we shared last quarter, that innovation is more comprehensive, and the end point of creativity must be innovation. I repeat, innovation is more is much more fuller in scope, and the end point of creativity must be innovation, which includes commercialization, which comes from scaling, and so on and so forth. Right now, I want us to talk very quickly about something, right? Economic creativity. There's a concept called economic creativity. Now, this is not unique to us in Amogaze, but it's something that some other writers spoke about, and I think it's important for us to speak about it because economic creativity is more supportive of the economic growth that we want to push for in this quarter's program, right? So, economic creativity, according to this researcher, is any form of creativity that results in codified knowledge with potential economic value. I'm going to say that again. Economic creativity, according to these researchers, right, is any form of creativity that results in codified knowledge. Take note of that expression, codified knowledge with potential economic value. Now, why did we find this interesting? We found this interesting because it synchronized strongly with what we are trying to push for this quarter, and that is economic growth, right? These researchers made a distinction between general creativity, which we may want to call exploratory innovation. It's not targeted particularly at attaining any economic targets, right? And economic creativity, which for them must have potential economic. Like we have said and we'll keep saying, so the fact that economic creativity is a form of creativity that results in codified knowledge with potential economic value does not necessarily translate into, if I may use that word, kinetic economic value. In other words, the fact that it has the potential for economic value does not necessarily translate into the realization of that potential for economic value. And the reason why this is important to us, much as we appreciate and value the researchers that have identified economic creativity, one question for us is that, is there any creativity ultimately that does not have any potential for economic value? And we are not very persuaded that there is any form of creativity that doesn't have a form of potential economic value. As a matter of fact, even these researchers identified that the codification of knowledge, according to them, is value already. Even the fact that knowledge is codified makes it easier for people to learn from what has been codified, including the failures, including the processes, including the stats and stops, like we said last quarter, that tends to be associated with innovation, especially in its exploratory stage, right? So there is always some form of value. For us this quarter, we are a little bit more interested in the process that ensures that the potential for economic value becomes realized. So economic creativity for us is a terminology we would rather substitute with economic innovation. I repeat, economic creativity for us is a terminology that we would rather advance and upgrade to economic innovation. Why? Because anytime you see innovation, it's already established that it goes beyond creativity all the way to implementation and commercialization. So now let's talk a little bit about that process. That process, of course, we can't go fully into it, and there'll be subsequent episodes all through the quarter, but I think it's important to highlight some of the factors that ensure the attainment of economic innovation. In other words, those elements that ensures that there is a higher likelihood that the creativity will translate into outcomes that would help economic growth. Now, one of those, a few, I won't say one, a few, I'll actually mention more than one that have been identified even by those who propose the economic creativity terminology. They have said that economic creativity has this ripple effect that goes beyond a given idea or project. In other words, that ripple effect is what translates into economic growth. However, for that ripple effect to happen, they have identified that there are certain things that the creators, right? And you know, when we talk about creators here, we are talking about the policy makers. We're not talking about individual creators. At the national level, it's not the responsibility of the individual creators. It is the responsibility of the policy makers, innovation policy designers to factor that in. So the creators must be supported and, where necessary, mandated to ensure that the economic creativity translates into the codification. That word is still important. The codification of the idea into some form of prototype, take note of that word, some form of model, take note of that word, some form of patent, very, very important, right? Patent, intellectual property allocation, right? Patent, database, training manuals, business plan, and so on. Those are some terminologies that we'll revisit in the days to come, in the episodes to come, by the grace of God. For economic creativity to occur, in other words, for there to be the realization of the economic potential in creative activities, right, the codification must happen. The ideas that have been conceptualized must now be codified. Take note of that. We must go from conceptualization to codification. The ideas that have been conceptualized must be codified to ensure that the ideas are translated into some kind of a prototype, in some kind of a model, in some kind of a patent, in some kind of a manual, in some kind of a document, in some kind of a template, in some kind of a database, in fact, into some kind of a software. Very important, because when this codification now happens, it now becomes easy to take that codification, to test it. Very important. We talked about that last quarter. We are repeating it, to pilot it, and once it has been, fine-tuned, you've experimented upon it, you're fine-tuned, you can now begin to mass produce. That's the scaling, right? You can now begin to mass produce, turning that codified idea into a product that can be exported, that can be shared, and that nations can derive optimum value from. Very, very important. You just try to imagine Mark Zuckerberg having the idea of Facebook and not codifying it in a form where he can export the software. Try to imagine Steve Jobs having the idea of Apple and not codifying it in a manner that it can be produced, where you can actually produce the first Apple computer or the first Apple iPhone. excuse me, you try to imagine the Wright brothers coming up with the idea of the airplane and not codifying it, not drawing it, not patenting it into an idea where the first airplane could be, created. So these are some of the things we are going to dwell more deeply on in this quarter by the grace of God, the codification of conceptualization. Yes, creativity is important, exploratory innovation is important, right? However, how do we move from that exploratory innovation to exploitative innovation? How do we transit from conceptualization to commercialization through codification? That's the element we are going to dwell a bit more on this quarter. We talk generally that innovation is about moving from conceptualization to commercialization last quarter. This quarter, we are now saying that path, that bridge between conceptualization and commercialization often has to do with codification. And that codification is what helps mass production, is what helps scaling. And that scaling is what translates into optimal economic growth, right? So we must learn to codify ideas. And when I say we, again, it's not just about the idea creators at the national level. It's about those developing the policies, those developing the processes, those developing the framework, those even providing the funding, ensuring that part of what they are funding is the codification of conceptualization for the purpose of commercialization. I'll say that again. Part of what national innovation systems must be supporting, especially with the mindset that they are trying to drive economic growth and innovation, part of what they must be supporting is the codification of conceptualization for the purpose of commercialization. That way, it becomes easier for nations to drive economic growth through innovation. I hope that you have enjoyed listening to us. I hope that you have, you have an appreciable understanding of the foundation we have tried to lay. We are still talking innovation in this quarter, but we are now looking more at the absorptive capacity, which we dwelt on significantly last quarter, but which we'll be dealing with almost exclusively in this quarter. This quarter, we are dwelling much more on the absorptive capacity, which is about economic growth, social and economic development that is supposed to come from creativity and innovation. Thank you so very much for doing this with us. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for listening to us. We look forward to hearing back from you. You are the reason why we do this. We'll continue to say this, right? We want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your feedback. Please follow us on Facebook, follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on Instagram, and follow us on YouTube, right? Subscribe to our YouTube channel where we come to you from now. You will see past programs that have been uploaded, programs from previous quarter, programs from my colleagues. You will learn a lot, you will grow a lot. We want to enrich you, not just as an individual, not just as an organization, but also as a nation. And remember, we are here to partner with you. We do not just speak, we do. We have the capacity to build these systems. We have the capacity to help you establish national innovation frameworks, help you develop your people, help you fine-tune, help you review, help you strengthen what is existing, and help you ensure that you stay responsive even to everyday national challenges like the current trade wars that are going on and the excessive tariffs that are being imposed from the United States. How do you fortify yourself as a nation, as a region, using innovation to, honestly bypass some of these seeming problems and turn those challenges into opportunities? Until I see you same time, same station next week. Remember, we have other programs that will be coming to you for the rest of the week from my other colleagues. It's a very rich and developmental quarter, like every other quarter, and we can't wait to hear back from you. Please send us your feedback. Contact at theamogate.org. Also reach us. You can have our website www.theamogate.org. You can send us a message on through our contact forms there. You can also send us a mail at contact@theamogate.org. You can also send us a message on any of our social media platforms, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and we cannot wait to work with you. That is our ultimate desire. The reason why we share all that we have learned so generously is so that you can see how much we can help you build, either as an organization, an institution, or as a nation. Thank you very much again. My name is Mr. Lomadara. We'll be back same station, same time next week by God's grace, and we'll continue to look at this issue of driving economic growth through innovation. Until then, take care of yourselves and be good. Have a good one. Bye.